What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, and welcome to the Pokemon Card Auctions of the Week recap. Folks, we had some big moves occur this past week in auction for both modern and vintage cards. So whoever's been telling you that the market has been dying down is surely misinformed, because folks, your wallets are going to sweat watching today's recap. Today's auction recap sponsor is the one and only lowpopping.com, your source for high-end investment-worthy Pokemon cards. If you are a collector, especially of vintage Pokemon grails, you're going to want to go check out lowpopping.com, where they have tons of product available, including PSA graded, Beckett graded, CGC graded, and even tag graded cards, as well as numerous autographed cards and sealed video games. And don't forget, if you don't have the cash on hand, you can still trade for the item or items that you must have for your collection. And you can still make offers on cards above $500, and there are also buy now, pay later options at your disposal as well. Lowpopping.com is a tried and true source for high-end investments. They're always adding to their inventory each and every week. I will put a link to the website in the description of this video. Please, folks, go check them out after this recap. I really appreciate your support. All right, everyone, let's ease slowly into this week's recap, starting off with the newest Japanese cards featuring this Mega Gengar EX in PSA 10, sold this week for $88, and then again for $137. And then we also saw this super rare Mega Charizard EX in PSA 10 sell for $335. On to some noteworthy modern card sales. Here we have the Gold Star Greninja from Celebrations. Hit a very impressive price of $1,075 as a PSA 10. We saw both of the modern Umbreon Chase cards come by. Here's the Umbreon EX from Prismatic that sold for $3,976, while the Moonbreon VMAX from Evolving Skies sold as a PSA 10 for $4,300 this week. We saw a couple of black label sales. Here is the Umbreon VMAX from Brilliant Stars. Got the black label and sold for $3,780. Here is a black label Sylveon VMAX from Evolving Skies, sold for $6,200 this week. And then here we have the Ancient Mew. This is the newer copy of the card, the 2019 copy. Got the black label and sold for $7,100 this week. And then we saw the Mimikyu Scream promo come by in PSA 10, and it sold for 10,850 big ones. And then on to some vintage product on eBay. We have this pack of first edition base set cards featuring the Charizard art that sold for $5,100. Now, there was no mention in the title or the description about it being weight or not, so I think we can assume that it's a light pack. And then we saw the same pack, but in a blister, sell for $10,182. Up next, we have three no rarity symbol PSA 10 Japanese base set starters here that sold for $5,722. We have a first edition Dark Charizard from Team Rocket, sold as a PSA 10 for a whopping $9,251, while the first edition Blaine's Charizard from Gym Challenge sold for an even $10,000 this week. And we haven't seen prices like this since late 2020, folks. And then here's another insane vintage Charizard. Here's the Charizard EX from Fire Red Leaf Green that sold for $15,200 as a PSA 10. On to the EX era, we have this reverse holo Espeon from Delta Species, sold for $3,300. Here's a Latios EX from Dragon Frontiers, sold as a PSA 10 for $4,100. Here's a Kyogre EX Black Star promo, sold for $6,483. Here we have a Blaziken Level X from Supreme Victors. We will see this card again later in the video. This copy here sold for $5,501. And then a couple of insane Gold Star card sales. Here is a Gold Star Vaporeon in PSA 10, sold for $14,100. Here's a PSA 1 Gold Star Rayquaza that's still sold for $6,700. Take a look at this card. It is most definitely in poor condition, but even a card in such poor condition like this still sells for $6,700. That is crazy. On to the Fanatics Collect Weekly Auction block. We have some holos from Diamond and Pearl and Platinum. Low pop holos. Here's a PSA 10 Meganium from Mysterious Treasures, sold for $1,950. The Feraligatr sold for $1,950 as well, and the Typhlosion sold for $2,640. And as much as I love the Diamond and Pearl era, these cards just don't do it for me. They just look terrible. Just terrible. Here is a holo Dialga from Platinum in PSA 10, sold for $2,010. Here's a holo Blissey from Diamond and Pearl Mysterious Treasures, sold for $2,010 as well. Here's a Holo Mismagius from Rising Rivals, sold for $2,040. This is a Pop 2 card as a PSA 10. Here's a Jirachi from Platinum Rising Rivals that sold for $2,070. Here's a Blaziken Holo from Platinum that sold for $2,130. Here's a Salamence Holo from Arceus that sold for $2,160. Here's a Rayquaza C from Supreme Victors, sold for $2,310. Here is a Lucario from Rising Rivals that sold for $2,640. This here is a Pop 4 card. Here is a Garchomp Holo from Mysterious Treasures, sold for $3,480. And then here is a beautiful Ampharos from Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders that sold for $3,600. A couple of PSA 10 Level X cards came by. Here's a Torterra from Diamond and Pearl Base, sold for $2,520. Here's a Regigigas Level X from Stormfront that sold for $4,920. Here's another Blaziken Level X. This one sold for $5,760. And then we have this Black Label Japanese Level X Snorlax that sold for $5,520. Here we have the Black Label McDonald's Pikachu promo that we keep covering, that I keep covering. This week it sold for $4,200. And then we saw the BGS 10 Pristine Pikachu Van Gogh promo that sold for $5,400. We saw all three of the Gold Star Legendary Beasts come by in PSA 10. Here's the Entei, sold for $5,160. The Suicune sold for $5,880. And the Raikou sold for $6,900. Here's a Gold Star Kyogre in PSA 10 that sold for $17,400. And then here's a BGS 10 Pristine First Edition Blaine's Arcanine from Gym Challenge. Now you don't see BGS 10 WotC cards come by very often. This one here sold for $7,200. And this is a Pop 2 in the BGS Pop Report. And then here is a 2016 XY Breakthrough Cosmos Holo Umbreon. That sold as a PSA 10 for $10,800. And this, folks, is a Pop 9 card. And then on to some base set action that occurred this week. Here's a CGC 10 Pristine Japanese base set Charizard, sold for $8,700, while the PSA 10 copy also sold for $8,700. Here is an unlimited Charizard from base set in PSA 10 that sold for $21,000. Here's a PSA 9 First Edition base set Charizard that sold for $43,200. A PSA 10 First Edition Venusaur sold for $48,000. And check this out, folks. This is truly insane. It is a PSA 10 First Edition base set Blastoise that sold for $90,000 this week. On to some insane booster box sales this week, folks. Here's an Evolving Skies booster box. Sold for $2,750. The Team Up box sold for $10,937. Here we have a First Edition Fossil booster box that sold for $27,500. An Unlimited Jungle booster box that sold for $22,500. And then here's an Unlimited base set booster box that sold for $27,500 as well. And then here we have what might be a new record price for a First Edition Team Rocket booster box, where it sold for $42,500. On to some more sealed product. Here are a couple of very expensive ETBs. Here is a Black and White Plasma Blast ETB that sold for $3,782. Here's an XY Furious Fist Elite Trainer box, sold for $4,061. Here we have a bunch of Scarlet and Violet Pokemon Center exclusive ETBs that sold total for $5,563. Here are both of the XY Primal Clash ETBs that sold for $5,795. Here are the XY Base Set Elite Trainer boxes sold for $6,832. Here's an XY Phantom Forces ETB that sold for $9,761. And then lastly, we have this Black and White Plasma Storm ETB that sold for $12,418. Up next, we have a sealed Base 2 booster box that sold for $14,640. Here is an Unlimited Gym Heroes box that sold for $15,860. Here's an Unlimited Gym Challenge booster box that sold for $19,520. Here is another Unlimited base set box This one here sold for $25,871. And then we saw a Green Wing variant of this box sell for $29,597. And then lastly, we saw this first edition Neo Genesis box sell for $56,249. On to a couple of graded card lots that I found interesting. Here we have the lot of all 16 unlimited base set holos in PSA 9, with the exception of one PSA 10. I think it was the Gyarados, sold for $7,320. Here we have all of the cards graded from Expedition with varying grades, sold for $16,503. Here are all the cards from Neo Genesis First Edition that sold for $24,278. And the grades, like I said, range anywhere from like a PSA 7 to a PSA 10 in this lot. Here is a lot of all the Aquapolis cards, graded by PSA, sold for $36,067. Up next, we have this Full Art Gengar EX from Phantom Forces in PSA 10, sold for $11,590. Here's a BGS 9.5 Gold Star Umbreon that sold for $20,130. Here is a Topps Chrome Techno Charizard, sold as a PSA 10 for $25,097. Here we have a CGC 10 Gem Mint Ishihara GX promo card that sold for $58,560. And then, folks, to finish off this recap, we have this lot of the Poncho Pikachus, all in PSA 10 here, sold for $80,703. And then here they are again, but in this listing, they also included the Mario Pikachu, Luigi Pikachu cards in PSA 10, sold for a grand total of $126,270. Whoo, boy, that's a lot of high-end auctions to go through, folks. I hope you enjoyed this week's recap. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. That's all I got for you today. I appreciate you watching, and I will catch you in my next one.